We are taught that golf is a game of internal solitude, a silent conversation between a man and his ball. It demands restraint, quiet contemplation, and a deep respect for the hushed tradition of the links. But what happens when that silence is utterly violently broken? This documentary is not merely the chronicle of a victory. It is an exploration into the physics of human emotion. The moment when 60,000 spectators ceased to be observers and became instead a single, living instrument of fate. Augusta National, April 13, 1986. The air was heavy with the perfume of blooming azaleas and the crushing weight of expectation. The leaderboard was a tapestry woven with youth and promise. Norman, Kite, Seve. Yet, all eyes were fixed on the 46-year-old monument, Jack Nicklaus. The Golden Bear, whose competitive spirit the press had already relegated to history books, was stalking the final holes. As Nicklaus stood over the ball on the 15th tee, the course was deceptively still, but the silence was merely the precursor to the storm. When that approach shot settled 6 feet from the pin, the reaction was unlike anything the hallowed grounds had ever witnessed. It was not applause, it was a physical force, a sound so enormous, so sudden, that it traveled across the rolling hills of the property, shaking the very earth beneath the spikes of the competitors. We call it the roar. For the man who generated it, this seismic roar was inspiration, a wave of energy providing the ultimate lift toward an improbable super assault. But for the young men playing ahead, or perhaps more critically, behind him, that noise was pure, unadulterated pressure. It was a psychological weapon that told them, without words, that the legend was coming, and he was carrying the hopes of an entire generation on his shoulders. The course records show the scores, but they fail to capture the sound that Sunday. They fail to register the moment when the collective will of the people became the ultimate hazard. Before we delve into the drama of that legendary Sunday back nine, we must ask, can the sound of a crowd truly break the concentration of the world's best golfers? Or does the responsibility for performance always rest solely on the player? We invite you to share your theory on the impact of the crowd's roar on the competitors. Tell us, was it fair play or an unfair advantage? Comment below. Augusta National is a cathedral built upon reverence and discipline. For decades, the fundamental rhythm of the Masters has been one of controlled acoustics. The rustle of the pine needles, the gentle whisper of the wind through the tall Georgia oaks, the quiet click of the camera shutters. These sounds are the expected liturgy. The patrons, trained in the decorum of the gentleman's game, understand their primary role, to witness in respectful silence. This controlled environment is not merely aesthetic, it is a critical component of major championship golf. It creates the perfect crucible for concentration, allowing the game's finest athletes to perform calculations of wind speed and green slope with surgical precision. But on the afternoon of Sunday, April 13, 1986, that sacred acoustic contract was violently, gloriously broken. What unfolded was not just a sporting event, but a profound, collective expression of human will, translated into pure, raw sound. The famed roar of Augusta ceased to be a simple cheer and became a meteorological event, a sonic shockwave that determined the fate of the green jacket. We must understand the psychology of this noise. In sports where noise is constant, the sustained bedlam of a football stadium, the brain adapts. But in golf, the sudden explosive sound following a successful shot acts as a psychological weapon against the opposition. It doesn't just inform them of the score, it disrupts their internal clock, forces an immediate reactive calculation, and often introduces doubt at the worst possible moment. By the time Jack Nicklaus, the Golden Bear, reached the back nine, the gallery had transformed from passive observers into a vast living amplifier. The volume began to swell around the 13th, the famed azalea hole, but the true seismic activity commenced at the 15th, Firethorn. Nicklaus, needing a miracle, had pulled his 4-iron for his second shot. When the ball settled perfectly on the green, the resulting explosion of noise was not localized. It was a wave that rolled across the entire property. Imagine, if you will, the competitors who were simultaneously attempting to navigate the treacherous final holes. Seve Ballesteros, the charismatic Spaniard, was perched precariously atop the leaderboard. He was standing near the 15th fairway, contemplating his approach, a moment demanding complete focus when the sound struck. It was a distant, yet undeniable thunderclap. The sound signaled instantly, unequivocally, that the old lion was charging. This massive, unconfirmed data point, The knowledge that Nicklaus had done something extraordinary forced Seve to rethink his strategy. The pressure to match the unknown score, the interruption of his flow state, was too great. Moments later, standing over his own approach, Ballesteros pushed his shot, finding the water. The roar, heard 2 holes away, had claimed its first victim. For Nicklaus, the veteran, this chaos was his element. Having battled galleries and pressure for 3 decades, he had learned to harness the energy, to filter the adulation into fuel. He was immune to the psychological sabotage that noise inflicted on the younger generation. The crowd was not outside him. The crowd was his caddy, his momentum. The crescendo built further on the short, iconic 16th hole, Redbud. Nicklaus hit his magnificent tee shot, which checked perfectly and rolled toward the hole. As the ball settled inches away, the noise reached levels approaching 120 decibels, a sound profile comparable to a pneumatic drill at close range or a jet during takeoff. It was a physical assault on the senses of anyone standing nearby, and certainly anyone attempting to concentrate on a downhill putt 3 holes back. And there is one more detail you cannot imagine. The vibrations caused by this collective euphoria were so intense, particularly in the low-lying areas near Rays Creek and the 12th hole, that scientists later theorized the sheer bass frequency of the crowd's collective shout may have subtly altered the density of the greens for a crucial few minutes. Patrons closer to the action reported feeling the ground itself tremble, a geological feedback loop caused by shared ecstasy. The final, definitive sonic climax occurred on the 17th, Nandina, when Nicklaus drained the 12-foot birdie putt, grabbing the outright lead for the first time all day. The resulting noise was the ultimate expression of disbelief and joy. It wasn't merely loud, it was primal. It was the sound of history being rewritten in real time. The 86 Masters is often summarized by the number 6, 6 green jackets 46 years old. But the enduring chronicle of that tournament is the sound. It was the year the gallery ceased to be an audience and became the most formidable force on the course, a force that propelled the legend and, quite literally, roared his adversaries into submission. It was a victory of spirit, yes, but also a victory of sound engineering, orchestrated by 50,000 beating hearts. For more stories that capture the unique, sometimes chaotic brilliance of this gentleman's game, consider subscribing. We are committed to preserving the deep history and the high drama of golf's greatest moments. We look forward to seeing you at the next tee. The Masters is often defined by its visual spectacle, the blinding white of the bunkers, the saturated green of the fairways, the electric pink of the azaleas against the towering Georgia pines. But to truly understand the events of April 13, 1986, one must close one's eyes and listen. This was not merely a visual triumph of skill, it was an auditory phenomenon. It was the day Augusta National, a place built on controlled decorum and hushed respect, quite literally erupted. Golf, they say, is a game played in the space between the ears. The stillness before the swing is sacred, a silence so profound that a stray camera click or the rustle of a pine needle can feel like an intrusion. But what happens when that sacred silence is shattered by a sound that defies classification? The Augusta roar is unique in sports. Unlike the sustained, constant and often drunken drone of a football stadium, this sound is instantaneous, explosive and profoundly directional. It travels through the natural amphitheater of the course like a shockwave, signaling a distant success or failure long before the nearest scoreboard can update. Let us consider the physics of that Sunday afternoon. Sound intensity is measured in decibels. A typical library registers around 40 dB. A running lawnmower, 90 dB. While official, objective measurements are scarce, the sanctity of the game precludes placing industrial decibel meters near the 18th green. Eyewitness accounts suggest peaks that rivaled a jet engine at takeoff. We are talking about bursts exceeding 120 decibels. For context, the human threshold for pain begins at approximately 130 dB. This acoustic environment created a distinct and immediate advantage for the man who was generating the noise, and a debilitating psychological hazard for those who were merely listening to it. By the time the Golden Bear reached the 15th tee, the momentum was palpable. He was chasing a leaderboard studded with younger, hungrier talent. Greg Norman, the imposing Shark, and the magnificent Spaniard, Seve Ballesteros, both in their prime. They were playing flawless golf, yet they were playing in a vacuum of uncertainty, hearing only the distant, terrifying confirmation of Nicklaus's success. Nicklaus, however, had the crowd as his kinetic partner. He knew instinctively that a roar meant a birdie, or even better, an eagle. The sound confirmed his success, reinforcing his confidence with every step. For the men ahead of him, the sound was corrosive. Imagine standing over a critical 6-foot putt on the 17th green, needing to save par, when suddenly a seismic wave of sound erupts from the 16th, half a mile away. That wave carries a clear, unambiguous message. He just did something magnificent. It forces a calculation, breeds doubt, and causes a palpable tightening of the grip. It transforms the solitary act of putting into a duel against an unseen roaring adversary. The true seismic shift began at the par 5 15th. Nicklaus, 46 years young, pulls the 4-iron. The ball sails toward the green, crossing the pond, landing softly. As it tracks toward the hole, the crowd's anticipation builds from a low hum to a frenzied, desperate crescendo. When the ball drops for the eagle, the sound is not just loud, it is physical. It shook the ground. Patrons later described feeling the vibration in their chests, a phenomenon known as infrasound, low-frequency vibrations that can affect human emotion and perception. This roar was not just applause. It was a release of 60 years of bottled-up tradition and reverence. This was the agonizing moment Seve Ballesteros, playing the 15th behind him, heard the terrible news. Seve, needing to respond to Nicklaus's 2-stroke swing, misjudged his own approach, finding the water. The contrast was brutal. Nicklaus's transcendent roar followed moments later by the demoralizing sound of Seve's splash. The 16th hole, the iconic par 3, brought the ultimate auditory declaration. Nicklaus's tee shot using the 5-iron lands perfectly, tracking. It stops inches from the cup. The resulting roar was perhaps the loudest sustained ovation of the entire day, a recognition not just of the shot, but of the seemingly impossible comeback. And there is one more detail you might not imagine: the specific acoustic architecture of the course. The noise generated by the thousands surrounding the 16th green was naturally funneled directly toward the 17th and 18th fairways. Greg Norman, who held the lead heading into the final stretch, was essentially playing the final 3 holes inside a sonic cannon aimed directly at his concentration. The Golden Bear had turned the topography of Augusta against his opponents. The final birdie putt on the 17th cemented the lead, but the walk up the 18th fairway was the coronation. The crowd was no longer reacting, they were propelling him. The applause was a wave of pure, unfiltered reverence that washed away decades of doubt. When the final putt dropped on the 18th, securing a back 9 score of 30, an astonishing feat for any player, let alone a man approaching 50, the noise was deafening, a communal sigh of relief and exhilaration that traveled beyond the confines of the golf course and into the annals of sporting history. 1986 was not merely Nicklaus's 6th green jacket. It was the definitive proof that in the gentleman's game, the crowd is not a passive observer. It is an active, kinetic force. The roar of '86 was the sound of a legend being carried across the finish line by the very tradition he helped to build. The scorecards tell one story. The sound recordings, preserved only in the memory of those present, tell another. Both confirm the miracle. For those who witnessed the sonic landscape of that Sunday, the memory remains pristine. For more stories that define the character and tradition of this sport, consider subscribing to our Chronicle. We shall meet again at the next tee. The true protagonist of that Sunday in 1986 was not necessarily the man in the signature yellow shirt, but the palpable, living energy that surrounded him, the crowd. Augusta National is a cathedral of concentration. Traditionally, its patrons observe a near-religious silence, broken only by a polite ripple of applause. But that Sunday, the silence was not merely broken, it was violently overthrown. What unfolded was a sonic phenomenon that transcended the boundaries of sport, becoming a geological event in the hills of Georgia. Let us consider the physics of the moment. Golf, unlike other major sports, often requires the leader to operate in a vacuum. A player like Greg Norman, navigating the treacherous back 9, relies on silence, on the internal rhythm that separates genius from error. Yet, on this day, the silence was replaced by a series of seismic eruptions. The first true tremor occurred at the 9th. A birdie by Nicklaus, an unexpected resurgence that shifted the mood from polite nostalgia to genuine, fierce belief. The resultant sound was not applause. It was a release, but it was the holes from the 12th onward where the sound became the ultimate weapon, an invisible force field protecting Nicklaus and a relentless hammer crushing the concentration of his rivals. Imagine the scene. Greg Norman, the Shark, was in command. He was playing controlled, immaculate golf. Seve Ballesteros, the charismatic Spaniard, was threading his way through Amen Corner, poised for victory. They were focused on their own battle, their eyes fixed on the leaderboard. And then the sound arrived. It is crucial to understand the topography of Augusta. The course is designed with valleys and bowls that naturally funnel and amplify noise. A cheer that begins on the 16th green can echo across the water, bounce off the massive pines near the 13th, and arrive at the 15th tee box like a sudden, disorienting thunderclap. When Nicklaus sank the eagle putt on the 15th, a moment of pure defiance turning a potential disaster into a dramatic lead change, the sound measured, according to anecdotal reports from those near the green, approached the decibel level of a jet engine taking off at close range. Think of what that does to the human nervous system. Norman was hundreds of yards away, yet the sound told him everything he needed to know instantly and unequivocally. The golden bear was awake. The old king was stirring. For Ballesteros, the impact was perhaps even more devastating. He was on the 15th, moments after Nicklaus had finished. He had pulled his approach shot into the water. Was it coincidence? Or did the sheer vibrational energy of the crowd, the expectation, the sudden transfer of momentum, contribute to that fatal, uncharacteristic error? The psychological pressure generated by the roar was a variable never before successfully deployed in a major championship. And there is one more detail you cannot imagine about the nature of this sound. It wasn't just loud, it was directional and informational. When a golfer hears a roar from a distant green, they don't just register the volume, they interpret the intent. A polite cheer is for a par save. A sustained, deafening roar means a major swing in the leaderboard, an eagle or perhaps a hole-in-one. Nicklaus, a veteran of these stages, used the sound as fuel. He knew intimately what each wave of noise meant. He rode the crest of the wave. The crowd, sensing his vulnerability and his sudden strength, became his caddy, his momentum driver. But for the younger contenders, Norman Ballesteros and Tom Kite, who had prepared for a silent intellectual battle of precision, the sound was disruptive, a constant visceral reminder that the narrative had shifted away from their technical mastery and back toward the force of the myth. The 16th hole provided the absolute crescendo. Nicklaus pulling out the 5-iron on the challenging par 3, hitting the ball high, watching it land, and then tracking the slope toward the hole. As the ball disappeared into the cup, the course exploded. It wasn't just noise, it was belief translated into pure physical energy. Seismologists, studying the pressure waves created by human crowds in stadiums, often refer to the standing wave phenomenon, where a synchronized mass reaction creates disproportionately large oscillations. This was the standing wave of golf history. The competitors, trying to navigate the final treacherous holes, were no longer playing merely against Nicklaus. They were playing against the weight of history, amplified tenfold by the collective voice of 40,000 people desperate for a fairy tale ending. It is the ultimate paradox of the gentleman's game. A sport built on quiet respect was ultimately decided by the most disrespectful, joyous noise imaginable. The roar of 86 proved that sometimes the greatest force in golf is not the perfectly struck drive, but the shared human yearning for the improbable. It was the sound that won the jacket. For those who wish to revisit the legendary scorecards and the moments that defined this seismic victory, consider joining us as we continue to chronicle the Masters. We shall meet again at the next tee. The galleries at Augusta National are unlike any other. They are not merely spectators, they are guardians of tradition, bound by an unwritten covenant of silence. The expected decorum of this cathedral of golf is a hushed reverence, where the highest praise is a polite ripple of applause, and the loudest sound is often the gentle click of a camera shutter or the crisp contact of steel upon a Titleist. But the 1986 Masters was not defined by silence. It was defined by noise. It was an auditory phenomenon, a seismic event that rolled through the Georgia pines, defying the very spirit of the gentleman's game. We speak, of course, of the roar. The unique topography of Augusta National, those deep ravines and rolling hills where Amen Corner is carved, acts as a gigantic natural amphitheater. Sound, once generated within those boundaries, does not dissipate easily. It is amplified, channeled, and focused. On that particular Sunday afternoon, as the 46-year-old Jack Nicklaus began his improbable charge, the crowd released an emotional energy that translated into physical, measurable noise. The roar began as a low murmur on the 10th fairway, a distant sound of hope. By the time Nicklaus hit his majestic tee shot on the par 3 16th, having already executed the legendary eagle birdie sequence on 15 and 16, that murmur had become a sustained, concussive wave. Consider the physics of the moment. We are not talking about simple cheering. This was the sound of 15,000 people, compressed by anticipation and raw disbelief, suddenly erupting. Reports from those on the ground suggest that the sustained volume near the 16th green momentarily exceeded 115 decibels, a level comparable to a jackhammer at close range or the takeoff thrust of a jet fighter. Crucially, the roar became an active participant in the tournament, functioning as an invisible external competitor. While Nicklaus, the veteran, seemed to absorb the noise, drawing energy from the affirmation of his greatness, his adversaries were miles away, forced to contend with an opponent they could not see. Imagine Seve Ballesteros, the charismatic Spaniard, standing over a critical approach on the 15th. He was still leading the tournament, managing his game with characteristic flair. But then the sound arrived, not as applause, but as a violent, immediate confirmation of Nicklaus's birdie on the 17th green, followed by the eagle on the 15th. The roar told the story instantly. It was a psychological weapon wielded by the crowd. Moments later, Seve's second shot into the water on the 15th was perhaps the direct result of this sudden auditory pressure. His concentration, that delicate focus required in the heat of a major, was fractured by the sound of history being written elsewhere. The same pressure bore down on Greg Norman, the Shark, who was playing flawless golf, only to falter in the final moments. Every time Norman heard that distant, deafening confirmation that Nicklaus was sinking yet another impossible putt, the margin for error shrank, not just on the scorecard, but within his own mind. The climax arrived on the 17th hole. Nicklaus had sunk his birdie putt, a magnificent effort that put him into the lead. The ensuing sound wave was so profound, so sustained, that it physically vibrated the television cameras positioned hundreds of yards away. It wasn't just noise, it was catharsis, the release of decades of reverence for the Golden Bear. This was the sonic signature of the greatest final round in Masters history. The volume wasn't arbitrary. It was the measure of disbelief, nostalgia, and pure, unadulterated sporting joy. It proved that sometimes, in this quietest of games, the crowd can indeed lift a legend across the finish line. The 1986 Masters remains the definitive study of how emotion, amplified by architecture, can become a force of nature, a force that changed the course of the tournament, one magnificent, deafening roar at a time. For more chronicles that define the heritage and tradition of this magnificent gentleman's game, kindly consider subscribing and sharing your thoughts below. We shall see you on the next tee.